will be covering the topic under these headings: introduction, use of IVIG in neurology, mechanism of action, pharmacology and monitoring, the stabilizers used in IVIG, dosing and administration, infusion rates, adverse effects. Are anti-IgA antibodies clinically relevant? Does a repeat course of IVIG help in severe GBS? And finally, the summary. Intravenous immunoglobulin preparations are preparations of immunoglobulins made from plasma pools obtained from more than 1,000 healthy donors per lot. IVIG consists of at least 90% intact immunoglobulin, which has intact Fc-dependent effector functions and only trace amounts of IgA or IgM. Four classes of IgG exist. Of these, IgG1 is the major component in IVIG preparations. Also, a liquid pasteurized 10% concentrated intravenous gamma globulin preparation is available and is as effective as a 5% concentrated preparation, making the concentrated versions more convenient to administer. Coming to the production of IVIG, production of IVIG takes approximately 9 months. The process begins with pooled human plasma from several thousand screened, paid, and volunteer donors. The WHO has published minimum standards for manufacturing IVIG preparations. These are: the IVIG should be extracted from a pool of at least 1,000 individual donors. It should contain as little IgA as possible. It should be free from preservatives or stabilizers that might accumulate in vivo, and the IgG molecules should have as little biochemical modification as possible and possess opsonizing and complement fixing activities. Coming to the production of IVIG in India, a couple of slides. In India, the plasma used is recovered plasma. The plasma is tested for 5 markers, that is hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, syphilis, and malaria. The viral inactivation is done by solvent, detergent, and removal by nanofiltration. Plasma pools for the production of human plasma medicinal products are distinguished according to the collected method and the donor remuneration status. Plasma types can be classified according to the method of collection, that is recovered versus source plasma. Recovered plasma is produced by separating donated whole blood into cellular components and plasma. Source plasma, on the other hand, is collected through apheresis, a process that only takes plasma from the donor while the cellular components are returned. According to the domestic Indian laws, source plasma collection for fractionation is not permitted, and hence the domestic plasma product production is largely dependent on the domestically available recovered plasma. Immune globulin products from human plasma were first used in 1952 to treat primary immune deficiency. Initially, these were administered by IM injection. Intravenous immunoglobulin was initially shown to be effective in immune thrombocytopenic purpura in 1981, and FDA first licensed this to treat 6 conditions. These were primary immunodeficiencies, immune-mediated thrombocytopenia, Kawasaki syndrome, recent bone marrow transplantations in patients aged or greater than or more equal to 20 years, chronic B-cell lymphocytic leukemia, and pediatric HIV infection. Since then, IVIG has been used to treat various autoimmune, infectious, and idiopathic diseases. The number of inflammatory and autoimmune diseases, especially when it is administered intravenously, has expanded enormously, and now a diverse range of disorders, including blistering skin diseases, transplant rejection, and various neurological disorders, are treated using IVIG. Coming to the use in neurology, the efficacy of IVIG has been proven in GB syndrome, CIDP, multifocal mononeuropathy, acute exacerbations of myasthenia gravis, and some paraneoplastic neuropathies. It is also recommended in certain cases of dermatomyositis and is a treatment option in polymyositis. IVIG also seems to have a favorable effect in certain paraneoplastic neurological disorders, stiff person syndrome, in some acute demyelinating diseases, and childhood refractory epilepsy. This table just shows the class of evidence for various neurological conditions: GB syndrome, CIDP, multifocal motor neuropathy, short-term efficacy for myasthenia gravis, dermatomyositis, stiff person syndrome. Coming to the mechanism of action, despite over 25 years of usage in autoimmune diseases, how a concentrated non-host immunoglobulin delivered intravenously produces its clinical effects remains fully unknown. Of the many potential mechanism of actions, whether one, all, or several together are important, it remains obscure. Immunoglobulin has several potential anti-inflammatory and immunomodulatory effects. The relative contribution of these in any particular individual is difficult to assess because different mechanisms may dominate in different diseases. However, more direct immunomodulating effects are generally considered neurologically relevant. IVIG reduces T cell proliferation, various pro-inflammatory cytokines are suppressed, and lymphocyte and monocyte apoptosis is induced. Endogenous immunoglobulin production and B cell differentiation are suppressed, and IgG catabolism is accelerated by IVIG. IVIG also seems to have a role in modulation of complement activation, suppression of idiotypic antibodies, and saturation of Fc receptors on macrophages. IVIG contains natural antibodies. The normal serum contains IgG, IgM, and IgA antibodies, which are referred to as natural antibodies because they are induced without any deliberate immunization, and these are independent of antigenic exposure. They are considered key to the immunomodulatory effects of IVIG in immune mediated disorders. Natural antibodies appear to be more polyreactive than immune antibodies. Natural antibodies can frequently bind to different antigens and can bind to pathogens, help remove senescent or altered molecules, cells, and tumors, can induce remyelination, and inhibit the growth of autoreactive B cell clones. In the multifocal motor neuropathy disease state, IVIG intercedes to stop complement deposition that is triggered by anti-IgM antibodies. However, direct actions on oligodendrocyte progenitors have been postulated to explain an effect in promoting experimental remyelination. Coming to the pharmacology, the IVIG that is available contains complete IgG molecules. The entire array of variable regions of the antibodies in normal serum is contained in IVIG. The IgG subclasses match those in normal human serum. Immunoglobulin also contains trace amounts of.
I think Dr. Modi,
Yes, sir.
we have to request the participants to mute themselves. Otherwise,
Yes,
it's
sir.
causing disturbance.
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Most of the preparations contain trace amounts of IgA, which can sensitize IgA deficient persons during long-term treatment. IgA deficient patients with severe recurrent viral or bacterial respiratory infections who may develop several severe anaphylactic reactions after an
देखो तो कितना
infusion.
ज्यादा लिखे हैं। जांच करा लो उसके बाद कम ज्यादा क्या है टैबलेट तो खा रहे हैं।
After an IVIG infusion should receive the first infusion in an hospital under medical supervision. There are several product characteristics that contribute to the tolerability of IVIG, and these relate to the processes employed to extract and purify immunoglobulin from human plasma. These include product purity, the presence of IgG aggregates, dimers, and fragments, level of IgA, osmolality, and use of excipients such as stabilizers and sodium. Stabilizers are added to IVIG products to prevent aggregation of immunoglobulin molecules during manufacturing and storage. In the absence of stabilizers, IVIG preparations must be formulated at a pH range of 4 to 4.5 in order to limit the formation of aggregates. Various types of compounds are used as stabilizers for this purpose, including sugars such as sucrose, glucose, and maltose, polyols such as sorbitol, and amino acids including glycine and proline. The selection of a particular stabilizer influences the formation, osmolality, and stability of the IVIG preparation, as well as the product's tolerability and risk profile with regards to adverse events. Coming to each stabilizer, let us couple of slides on each stabilizer and how they influence the glucose homeostasis and affect renal function. Coming to sucrose, sucrose has been used as a stabilizer in several IVIG products. Compared with other organic osmolytes, sucrose is an intermediate strength protein stabilizer. In one study, 10% sucrose effectively prevented aggregation of IgG molecules and reduced dimer formation in 10% solutions of IgIg at a pH range of 4.1 to 6.8. Sucrose is enzymatically hydrolyzed in the stomach or within the duodenum via an enzyme sucrase into its component sugars, which are then readily absorbed into the bloodstream. However, after an intravenous infusion, this cannot happen and sucrose is eliminated exclusively by the kidneys. Therefore, after an intravenous administration of sucrose, it has no impact on blood glucose levels. At high doses of IVIG, considerable levels of sucrose can accumulate in the proximal tubules of the kidneys, causing osmotically driven cellular vacuolation and swelling, with subsequent narrowing and occlusion of the tubular lumen. Glucose as a stabilizer, it produces an appreciable rise in blood glucose and plasma insulin level, and at infusion rates which are comparable to those used for administration of IVIG, glucose in normal subjects, there is infusion of IVIG containing glucose in normal subjects produces a rapid and significant elevation of blood glucose and insulin levels. This observation suggests that the use of glucose stabilized IVIG products may influence diabetic control and insulin requirements in diabetic patients. Diabetic patients treated with such products may be at risk for hyperglycemia. Excess accumulation of glucose has a deleterious effect on proximal kidney tubules in humans. Coming to maltose, maltose is broken down to glucose by the action of maltase. Maltase is widely distributed in mammalian tissue, including heart, liver, skeletal muscle, and the brush ball. However, after intravenous administration, maltose is primarily metabolized in the kidney and generally very little is excreted in the urine. Maltose has been used as a stabilizer in several IVIG products. At a concentration of 10%, maltose prevents aggregate formation in 10. In contrast to IV administration of glucose, infusion of maltose doesn't result in an appreciable elevation of blood glucose levels in normal or diabetic individuals due to its renal metabolism and competitive reabsorption. Osmotic nephropathy and ARF have been reported in patients following treatment with maltose stabilized IVIG. There is one point here, however, that some glucometers recognize maltose as glucose, and that can give an erroneously high reading of RBS checked when maltose stabilizers are used. So we should be aware of that. A possible mechanism of ARF when maltose is used is inhibition of maltase present in the brush border of proximal renal tubules under conditions of coexisting hyperglycemia. Thus, patients with diabetes who have poor glycemic control, these patients may be predisposed to ARF. after administration of IVIG containing maltose. And nephrotoxicity may also occur in patients with diminished maltase activity secondary to renal tubular damage associated with their underlying disease. Sorbitol, in contrast to intravenous administration of glucose, infusion of sorbitol doesn't affect glucose homeostasis. It is metabolized in liver in an insulin independent fashion, and hence it should not influence diabetic control and insulin requirements in diabetic patients. And this is a safe option in such patients. Additionally, there have been no reports of sorbitol interference with blood glucose monitoring technology, nor of any clinical impact on patients. Compared with other IVIG products with stabilized with other sugars, sorbitol stabilized IVIG appears to be associated with a lower risk for acute renal failure. It is actually renoprotective. In renal medullary cells, osmotic equilibrium with elevated extracellular NaCl concentrations is achieved primarily by intracellular accumulation of organic osmolytes, which include sorbitol, betaine, inositol, glycerophosphocholine, and taurine. And hence, sorbitol plays a physiologically protective role as an organic osmolyte in the kidneys. However, uh, sorbitol containing IVIG is contraindicated in patients with hereditary fructose intolerance, which is a rare genetic disorder of fructose metabolism due to deficiency of enzyme aldolase B in the liver, kidneys, and small intestines. And these patients should not receive sorbitol stabilized IVIG. Coming to glycine, amino acid stabilizers have been employed in IVIG products as alternative to sugars and are formulated at a generally lower pH to optimize IgG stability. In one study, 250 millimoles per liter glycine was less effective than sucrose and maltose in preventing aggregate formation in 10% solution. Infusion of glycine stabilized IVIG would have any impact on glucose homeostasis in normal individuals or in those with diabetes, and ARF due to osmotic nephrosis has a modest protein stabilizing effect compared with other osmolytes. At a concentration of 250 millimoles per liter, it is comparable to maltose in 10% solutions. However, it is more effective in preventing dimer formation than sucrose or maltose. And additionally, L-proline is superior to glycine in preventing aggregate formation and reducing dimer levels. Increased blood of glucose are not anticipated following L-proline stabilized IVIG infusion, and ARF due to osmotic nephrosis has not been reported. However, pigment-mediated acute kidney injury secondary to hemoglobinuria following administration of L-proline stabilized IVIG has been reported recently. Few slides about the stabilizers used in our Indian brands. Uh, this is Globucell. Both 5% and 10% solution, concentrated solutions use maltose as stabilizer, and this is the distribution of immunoglobulins. IgA content is less than 80 milligrams per liter. Reliance IVIG uses maltose for its 5% solution and glycine for its 10% solution, and Plasmagen uses same maltose for its 5% solution and glycine as in the 10% solution as a stabilizer. IVIG is not a generic product and its products are not interchangeable. A specific IVIG product needs to be matched to patient's characteristic to ensure safety. For example, there are some products that are contraindicated in certain medical conditions, as we discussed previously. Some use glucose as a stabilizer, and that would not be recommended for diabetics. Others which have high sodium content would not be appropriate for individuals with cardiac conditions. Also, as the manufacture of the individual products is different, individual patients may experience adverse events in response to some, but not other products. And a patient stably receiving a particular product should be maintained on that particular therapy. Immune Deficiency Foundation's patient survey in 2002 found that 34% of all infusion related adverse events occur in the context of a product change. Coming to dosing and administration, IVIG liquid products that have been stored in refrigerators should be allowed to come to room temperature before administration to minimize adverse effects. Patients receiving IVIG should be well hydrated prior to infusion. This is particularly important for patients with risk factors.
Dr. Sailesh,
Sir.
hello, your PPT is gone.
Upload it again, sir.
Yeah, I think. And your audio also
Somebody.
is sometimes breaking off.
Okay, sir.
Can you just go back? Yeah, we can see the PowerPoint.
Yes, sir. Patients
Yeah.
receiving IVIG should be well hydrated prior to infusion. This is particularly important for patients with risk factors for thrombosis and renal complications of IVIG therapy. In patients who require anti-inflammatory effects of IVIG, high doses are typically required. This will usually range from 1 to 2 grams per kg as a single dose. The pharmacokinetic properties of IVIG in healthy persons are well defined and last approximately 22 days. IVIG therapy should always be monitored, and obtaining a history and performing a physical examination with an emphasis regarding hepatic or renal disease or a history of reactions to blood products or transfusion reactions is very essential. Coming to infusion rates, individual products recommend different weight-based rates of infusion. Adverse reactions tend to be related to the rate of infusion and often resolve with stopping or slowing the infusion rate. Severe reactions are uncommon and are most likely to occur during the first infusion, but may occur subsequently also. Symptoms or signs of reactions may include dyspnea, wheezing, chest tightness, coughing, changes in blood pressure, tachycardia, flushing, fever, rigors, skin rash or urticaria, headache, vomiting, nausea, and abdominal back pain. Every product has a standardized infusion rate. These are certain weight-based standardized infusion rates for some of the international products. This is Gamma Guard, the infusion rate according to the weight. This is a chart. This is Gamunex. These are the standard infusion rates for one of our Indian products. To avoid confusion, Australian Society of Clinical Immunology and Allergy has developed standardized infusion rates for both 5% and 10% solutions regardless of the product. These rates are generally well tolerated. For the first infusion of 10% IVIG products, a rate of infusion of 0.5 ml per kg per hour for the first 30 minutes is taken. And if there are no adverse reactions to this rate, it can be increased every 30 minutes to a maximum rate of 3 ml per kg per hour. For subsequent infusions, if there are no reactions to the first infusion, subsequent infusions should be started at 0.5 ml per kg per hour for the first 15 minutes, and they can be increased every 15 minutes to a maximum infusion rate of 3 ml per kg per hour. However, patients who are considered at risk with comorbidities such as cardiac disease or renal failure should have a maximum infusion rate of 200 ml per hour. For 5% IVIG products, the infusion should be started at 1 ml per kg per hour for the first 30 minutes, and this can be increased every 30 minutes to a maximum rate of 6 ml per kg per hour. For subsequent infusions of 5% IVIG products, the initial rate is same at 1 ml per kg per hour. However, it can be increased every 15 minutes to a maximum infusion rate of 6 ml per kg per hour. This is a tabular representation for 10% IVIG product. First infusion, start the rate at 0.5 ml per kg per hour, and we can increase it every 30 minutes to a rate of maximum rate of 3 ml per kg per hour. For 5% IVIG products, the initial rate is 1 ml per kg per hour, and we can reach a maximum rate of 6 ml per kg per hour. For subsequent infusions, the initial rate is same. However, the speed with which we can increase is every 15 minutes instead of every 30 minutes. The maximum rate is same. However, the maximum rate should not exceed 300 ml per hour in 10% products and should not exceed 500 ml per hour in 5% products. Coming to adverse effects, undesirable effects from IVIG are reported to occur in up to 5 to 15% of all IVIG infusions and affect about 20 to 50% of all individuals receiving IVIG. Most of these are mild, reversible, and transient. The most common adverse effects occur soon after infusion and can include headache, flushing, chills, myalgia, wheezing, tachycardia, low back pain, nausea, and hypotension. If this happens during an infusion, the infusion should be slowed or stopped. If the symptoms are anticipated, a patient can be pre-medicated with antihistamines and intravenous hydrocortisone. The risk of adverse reaction generally correlates with the dose of IVIG and the rate of infusion. We can classify the adverse events as immediate or delayed. Immediate adverse effects may include flu-like syndrome, dermatological side effects, arrhythmia, hypotension, and transfusion-related acute lung injury. Immediate side effects can be further categorized as mild, moderate, and severe. When mild adverse effects occur, the infusion has to be slowed down or antihistamines and NSAIDs can be administered. Moderate adverse effects include chest pain, inhalation, vomiting, arthralgia, and severe headache. These effects require the infusion to be discontinued and antihistamines and NSAIDs to be administered. Severe adverse effects include hypertension, anaphylaxis, bronchospasm, and altered consciousness. And these adverse effects require the infusion to be stopped immediately, and corresponding medical attention has to be provided immediately. Coming to the dermatological adverse effects, the incidence is nearly 6%. The manifestation of dermatological adverse effects vary among individuals and can include urticaria, spot papules, eczema, pompiliox, lichenoid dermatitis, and desquamation. Epidermolysis is observed in some severe cases, and all of these skin lesions can occur in all parts of the body, although the hands and feet are the most common sites. IVIG can induce reactions in patients with IgA deficiency. This occurs in about 1 in 1,000 patients, and serious anaphylactoid reactions can occur soon after the administration of IVIG. Anaphylaxis is associated with sensitization to IgA in patients with IgA deficiency can be prevented by using IgA depleted immune globulin. The presence of IgG anti-IgA antibodies is not always associated with severe adverse reactions to IVIG. An uncommon but potentially irreversible adverse event is acute renal failure. It usually occurs in preparations with sucrose used as a stabilizer. Products containing sucrose as stabilizer are mainly associated with such injury through mechanism of osmotic nephrosis. Pre-existing renal disease, volume depletion, and old age are risk factors for such toxicity. It is also associated with rare cases of thrombosis, DIC, transient serum sickness, and transient neutropenia. Coming to IVIG associated acute renal failure, uh, the original formulations of IVIG, which was first approved in 1981, did not contain stabilizers. And because of this, undesirable side effects were seen with these early preparations, which included fever, chills, fatigue, chest, hip, joint, and back pain. These effects were thought to be due to the formulation of immunoglobulin aggregates. To reduce the formation of these aggregates, stabilizers were added to IVIG formulations. These added stabilizers, as discussed previously, can be sugars such as sucrose, maltose, glucose, and sorbitol, and glycine, albumin, and proline may also serve as stabilizers. Unfortunately, these stabilizers are implicated in the development of adverse renal events. The proposed mechanism of adverse renal events is believed to be due to hyperosmolality caused by the stabilizers. Renal tubular injury occurs when sucrose, a stabilizer like a large carbohydrate molecule, is taken up by tubular epithelial cells by a process called pinocytosis. This causes incorporation of sucrose into lysosomes, which causes swelling of epithelial cells and cytoplasmic vacuolization of the tubules. The swelling and vacuolization cause the tubular lumina to narrow, leading to injury and degeneration of the proximal tubular epithelium. Similar injury has been observed with non-metabolizable macromolecules such as mannitol, dextran, and radiocontrast infusion, and therefore a term osmotic nephrosis has been used to describe ARF associated with these osmotically active molecules. So the sucrose is taken up by the proximal tubular cells by a process called pinocytosis, and this causes formation of vacuoles containing macromolecules, which causes accumulation of cellular water due to oncotic gradient generated across the cell membrane, which induces swelling of the cell as well as the and then causes tubular luminar occlusion from the swollen tubular cells. Sucrose is the IVIG stabilizer most commonly associated with adverse renal events, perhaps because it has the highest osmotic activity of the stabilizers used in IVIG products. Moreover, sucrose is metabolized by an enzyme called sucrase, which is found only in the intestine. All the other IVIG stabilizers are metabolized in the liver. Since IVIG products are administered intravenously, sucrose cannot be metabolized in the intestine, and this results in its elimination unchanged in urine, resulting in osmotic nephrosis. Cautious use of IVIG is recommended in patients at increased risk for adverse renal events, including those with renal impairment, diabetes, age greater than 65 years, dehydration, hypovolemia, sepsis, paraproteinemia, or concomitant use of nephrotoxic drugs. Adverse renal events usually occur within 1 week of IVIG administration. Renal damage is usually reversible with discontinuation of therapy, and renal function typically returns to baseline within 2 weeks. However, about 30% of patients who develop ARF require short-term hemodialysis, and about 10% of cases are fatal. Peak serum creatinine is usually seen on the 5th day, and the mean recovery time is about 10 days. Theoretically, the new generation IVIG products which use maltose, glucose, or glycine as stabilizing agents instead of sucrose should not lead to osmotic injury, as the tubular brush border enzymes metabolize them. However, the incidence and intensity of renal impairment may vary with different preparations. Perhaps IVIG itself is tubular toxic, and putative stabilizing agents might contribute to the renal injury with varying degrees of propensity. Coming to thrombosis, thrombotic events are serious adverse effects with an estimated incidence of about 1 to 16%. Risk factors include first infusion containing a large dose, advanced age, prolonged immobilization, hypercoagulable conditions, history of venous or arterial thrombosis, use of estrogens, indwelling central vascular catheters, hyperviscosity, cardiovascular risk factors and pre-existing atherosclerotic disease, and a hereditary hypercoagulable state or ITP. Rajbali et al. Found that patients with coronary artery disease and prior thrombosis who were administered a daily dose of more than 35 grams of IVIG had a very high risk of thrombotic events. However, thrombosis may occur in the absence of known risk factors. The possible mechanisms of thrombosis include increase in plasma viscosity, platelet and endothelial activation, and arterial spasms. For patients at risk for thrombosis, IVIG should be administered at a minimum dose, preferably 5% concentrated solution at an infusion rate which is maximum practicable. Ensure adequate hydration in patients before administration of IVIG and monitor for signs and symptoms of thrombosis and assess blood viscosity in patients at risk for hyperviscosity. The FDA guidelines for prevention of thromboembolic events include a restricted concentration of the product, no more than 5% IVIG, a monitored infusion at a rate of 0.5 mg per kg per hour and not exceeding 4 mg per kg per hour. And a risk benefit assessment should be done on every patient. The impact of osmolality on thrombosis. Hyperosmotic IVIG products that exceed the physiological range of 280 to 296 milliosmoles per kg have a possible association with thrombotic events. The concentration of the sugar, salt, and non-IgG proteins such as albumin contribute to the osmolality of IVIG, which varies widely among the available products. And thus the use of products that are close to physiological osmolality has been recommended. Coming to hemolysis and neutropenia, hemolysis is an adverse effect related to IVIG administration that occurs in approximately 1.6% of patients, but is usually neither recognized nor treated because it lacks clinical symptoms. However, it can result in acute renal failure and thrombosis. It is diagnosed when we find low hemoglobin levels on blood examination. IVIG infusion associated hemolysis is observed from 12 hours to 10 days after the first infusion, and with the lowest hemoglobin level occurring between day 1 to 2 weeks after the last IVIG infusion. Hemolysis is a common complication of high dose IVIG, which is derived from non-group O blood. This effect may be associated with the presence of A and B isoagglutinin in the IVIG product. Several IVIG products have been associated with positive Coombs test and or frank hemolysis. Thus, when high dose IVIG is to be given over 2 or more days for treating autoimmune disorders, it is prudent to check for a drop in hemoglobin or Coombs positivity before proceeding with the second or subsequent doses. If a previously negative Coombs test becomes positive, one or the more of following may be done. We can switch the patient to a different IVIG preparation in which isohemagglutins have been reduced. We can delay or fractionate the remaining dose or evaluate hematologically for a possible development of autoimmune hemolytic anemia, especially in individuals with certain hematological malignancies or common variable immune deficiency. Coming to the neurological adverse effects, these include headache, aseptic meningitis, PRES, seizures, and abducens nerve palsy. Aseptic meningitis has been identified as an adverse effect of IVIG and affects 0.6 to 1% of patients and remains an uncommon adverse event. Special considerations are necessary for patients with a history of migraine headaches, including a slow infusion, and pre-medication with paracetamol and antihistamines are warranted sometimes. Meningitis may be due to the formation of macroaggregates, crossing of the blood-brain barrier by the immunoglobulin, or stimulation by antigenic determinants of the endothelial meningeal arteries. Coming to IVIG and PRES. Posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome is another neurological disorder that can develop following immunoglobulin therapy. In 2005, Nakjia reported a patient with MFS who developed PRES following IVIG therapy. Stetfield and Ribeiro et al. Later reported additional MFS patients who developed PRES during immunoglobulin infusion. The clinical manifestations in these patients are same as in any other case of PRES. However, in all of these cases, complete resolution was achieved after immunoglobulin administration was ceased. While PRES is a rare complication of IVIG treatment, it should be considered in all cases with disease-typical MRI findings and clinical manifestations. GVS can cause PRES by hypertension and present as central nervous system lesions. It is important to treat hypertension before using IVIG when PRES is suspected as a complication of GVS, since the encephalopathy can be exacerbated by IVIG. Although most cases of PRES has been reported in relation to GVS or related disorders, there are case reports wherein dysautonomia couldn't have been the only explanation for causing PRES. For example, there is a case report which of PRES after use of IVIG to treat a suspected case of SJS. Coming to a very important topic, are anti-IgA antibodies clinically relevant? The major questions regarding this that remain unresolved are: which investigation should be performed in individuals in whom we find IgA deficiency, and should we monitor these patients over the years? Should we check IgA and or anti-IgA antibody concentrations in all patients about to receive blood or blood products? Which anti-IgA antibodies in terms of isotype or specificity should we test for? If anti-IgA antibodies are detected, should the titers be monitored? And is the use of low IgA IVG justified in all patients with IgA deficiency, irrespective of high costs? Let us try to find answers for some of these questions in the coming slides. IgA deficiency is currently recognized as the most frequent immunodeficiency. Individuals with IgA deficiency are largely considered to be healthy. Almost 80% of them are asymptomatic, and when discovered are usually not investigated further or followed up. In patients with IgA deficiency, the frequency of anti-IgA antibodies has been reported to be from 20 to 40% and up to 10% of patients with common variable immunodeficiency. The rare occasion when IgA deficiency is cause for concern is when these individuals require blood or blood products, in which current practice advises that these products containing IgA must not be administered. On these occasions, it is often, but not always, practiced to check for presence of anti-IgA antibodies. The importance of this is still frequently disputed. The role of anti-IgA antibodies in inducing and predicting adverse reactions remain controversial. In addition to IgG antibodies, which constitute the largest percentage of antibodies, IVIG products also contain various amounts of IgM and IgA. Some IgA deficient patients can experience anaphylactic or anaphylactoid reactions when these products are given. The overall incidence, however, is very low. The major of these reactions are more appropriately described as anaphylactoid, unlike a true anaphylactic reaction. The question is how relevant this concern is for the majority of IgA deficient patients. Early researchers determined that severe anaphylactoid or anaphylactic reactions to IVIG were most likely to occur in patients who are severely deficient of IgA and who have anti-IgA antibodies of the IgE type. There has never been, however, a study which has demonstrated that IVIG-related side effects increase with increasing levels of IgA in the various brands of IVIG. Therefore, the tolerability of an individual IVIG product would appear to be dependent on other factors than IgA content. The presence of IgA antibodies of the IgG type usually do not predispose to anaphylactic or anaphylactoid reactions when administered IVIG containing moderate amounts of IgA. Class-specific anti-IgA antibodies are actually present in approximately a third of patients with IgA deficiency. However, anaphylaxis from IVIG is very rare, which illustrates that the relationship between anti-IgA antibodies and anaphylaxis is not straightforward. All the manufacturers' package inserts list selective IgA deficiency as a contraindication. However, many patients with IgA deficiency require IVIG therapy, and IVIG products are frequently prescribed in these patients, as many of them also have IgG subclass deficiencies. In such cases, IVIG has been safely used in a large number of IgA deficient patients. In those IgA deficient patients who experience any reactions to the products, it has been demonstrated that most of these patients could be safely given an IVIG product with low levels of IgA. While most patients, even those with anti-IgA antibodies, will tolerate most IVIG products, alternative options like subcutaneous IVIG or products containing moderate amounts of IgA can be used. In fact, clinicians need to be aware that anaphylactic or anaphylactoid reactions can occur in any patients receiving IVIG products, irrespective of the anti-IgA antibodies. A large study from the National Blood Service in Sheffield demonstrated that far fewer individuals with IgA deficiency and anti-IgA antibodies developed transfusion reactions than would be expected if anti-IgA antibodies were always involved. The frequency of transfusion reactions were approximately 1 in 30,000. The frequency of patients with anti-IgA deficiency was approximately 1 in 900. And in these patients, anti-IgA antibodies were detected in only about 1/3. Taken together, the importance of anti-IgA antibodies in patients with IgA deficiency remain unclear, and a summary of the available data demonstrates the following: that IgG therapy should never be withheld from a patient with IgA deficiency solely because of the concern for the theoretical risk of a serious adverse reaction. There are insufficient data to warrant a general recommendation for screening of anti-IgA antibodies in these patients. The predictive value of a positive result of any level is not established, although there might be increased risk at higher levels. In any patient, regardless of IgA level, who is having significant systemic symptoms with IVIG, consider switching to subcutaneous immunoglobulin. If a patient who is IgA deficient is reacting to IVIG and subcutaneous IgG is not an option, then consider using a low IgA content product, especially if there is a high level of IgG anti-A antibodies. In conclusion, there is no evidence that choosing a product with IgA content greater than 25 milligrams per milliliter puts the patient at definite risk for anaphylaxis. Coming to one more important topic, does a repeat course of IVIG help in severe GBS? Now, plasma exchange was first introduced as possible treatment in 1978 and was shown to offer significant benefit by randomized trial published in 1985. It since then became the gold standard against which other treatments were measured. IVIG was introduced in 1998, and in 1992, the first randomized trial comparing IVIG and plasma exchange showed similar effects from each treatment. Information, however, is lacking about how to treat patients who worsen or fail to improve after being treated with IVIG or plasma exchange. One thing is clear: sequential treatment using plasma exchange followed by IVIG offers no additional benefit. However, it is common practice to retreat patients who improve or stabilize and then relapse with IVIG or PE again with IVIG or PE, whatever was given before. Some centers treat patients again if they fail to improve after 2 or 3 weeks, but the evidence for this practice is probably lacking. Why this debate of a repeat course of IVIG? Actually, the regimen for IVIG administration in GBS patients was determined arbitrarily, mainly by extrapolation from studies on hematological autoimmune disorders. This regimen is actually based on the serendipitous 1981 observation that 5 consecutive daily repetitions of the monthly dose of IVIG for immune deficiencies at that time normalized the platelet counts in immune deficient patients who had also had immune thrombocytopenia. However, not all patients of GBS show a good recovery after the standard dose, and alternative doses and regimens of IVIG administration have not been tested in GBS patients. The pharmacokinetic properties of IVIG are highly variable and vary between individuals, implying that this dose is suboptimal for some patients. Now, I have few slides which are pro and which do not recommend. Some recommend, some do not recommend a repeat course. Let us go with a couple of slides. In 2008, these EFNS guidelines for use of intravenous immunoglobulin in treatment of neurological disorders, they say that patients who improve after IVIG and then relapse should preferentially be retreated with a second course of IVIG. In patients who seem to be unresponsive to the first course of IVIG, a second course may be tried, but evidence supporting such a strategy is lacking. This study was published in 2019, wherein they compared disease course in patients with GBS with a poor prognosis who were treated with 1 or 2 IVIG courses. The conclusions were this observational study did not show better outcomes after a second IVIG course in GBS with poor prognosis. This study was limited by small numbers and baseline imbalances. Lack of improvement was likely an incentive to start a second IVIG course. However, a prospective randomized trial is needed to evaluate whether a second IVIG course improves the outcome. This was posted on November 25th, 2019. This was an update from the International Guillain-Barré Outcome Study, who posted diagnosis and management of Guillain-Barré syndrome in 10 steps. The 8th step was, among the 10, the 8th step was that for treatment-related fluctuation, repeat the same treatment. In patients who have no initial response or incomplete recovery, there is no evidence for repeating a treatment. This was posted in Neurology Alert by Michael Rubin in January 1st, 2020. It was in an open label non-randomized control trial using a second course of IVIG. There was no benefit was observed. So they reported that no additional treatment is helpful. Now coming to some reports and studies who recommend a second course. In this case report of 3 patients, 2 patients from Argentina and 1 patient from Mayo Clinic, who were on mechanical ventilation, who presented with axonal variants of GBS with autonomic dysfunction, bulbar impairment, and Erasmus score of more than 6, who showed no improvement with IVIG infusion, first IVIG infusion. A second IVIG infusion, after the second IVIG infusion, after 6 weeks, all the 3 patients on an average of 5 days were weaned off of mechanical ventilation and showed resolution of their blood pressure and heart rate fluctuation. And they concluded that a second cycle of IVIG may be an option for treating severe forms of GBS. This one from Journal of Clinical Immunology in 2010, wherein they studied 174 patients retrospectively, and they studied the level of increase in the serum IgG level after a standard IVIG dose. They showed that a fewer patients reached the ability to walk unaided at 6 months after correction for the known clinical prognostic factors in the patients where the increase in serum IgG level was minor. It is yet not known why some GBS patients only have a minor increase after standard IVIG treatment. And by using EGOS, it is possible to select GBS patients with a poor prognosis, and these patients may potentially benefit from a second course of IVIG. This was from treatment guidelines from GB syndrome in Annals of Indian Academy of Neurology in 2011. In this, it was suggested that about 5 to 10% of patients with GBS deteriorate after initial improvement or stabilization following IVIG treatment. And in these patients, a second course of IVIG may be considered. These patients are thought to have a prolonged immune response that causes persistent nerve damage, and they need treatment for a longer period of time. Using the database of prospective observational IGOS, which included GBS patients within the first 2 weeks of onset, a comparison was made with respect to disease course of patients who were treated with one course over 2 courses. And they stated that certain subsets of patients with GBS might benefit from more intensive immunotherapy, such as those who do not respond to the usual treatment course, relapse after a short period of improvement, who do not have adequate increase in IgG levels after IVIG treatment, or have initial poor prognosis. This is very interesting. The 174 patients who were studied, in this actually the variation, they studied the variation in serum IgG levels, and they saw that the variation was more pronounced in the samples at 2 weeks and to a lesser extent at 4 weeks. They obtained samples pre-treatment and at 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 months and 6 months after treatment. And they investigated the pharmacokinetics of IVIG, and the change in IVIG, which was calculated by subtracting the baseline level from the level at 2 weeks, was labeled as delta IgG. And there was a large variability in delta IgG 2 weeks after the IVIG treatment. It turned out that patients with low delta IgG had significantly prolonged time to reach GBS disability score of less than 2. Using multivariate logistic regression, it was shown that neither baseline IgG levels nor IgG levels at 2 weeks were significant. However, the difference between the two, that is increase in the IgG level 2 weeks after the standard IVIG, that is delta IgG, was associated with outcome. It appeared that in patients with a delta IgG of less than 3.99 grams per liter, they were 4 times less likely, and patients with delta IgG of 3.99 to 7.3 grams per liter were less than 3 times likely to walk unaided after 6 months than patients who had a delta IgG level of more than 10.92 grams per liter. This is the first study to show that high increase in IgG levels after IVIG treatment for GBS is associated with a better prognosis. This may indicate that patients with a small increase in serum IgG level may benefit from a higher dosage or a second course of IVIG. Now, coming to this safety of IVIG during pregnancy and lactation, the general consensus is that IVIG is safe in pregnancy, and it is often administered after delivery to deter relapse events that may occur in the postpartum period. It is safe to receive during pregnancy, and in fact it is used with high risk pregnancies to prevent loss, and is often administered after delivery to prevent relapse events in multiple sclerosis. It is also used in conjunction with IVF procedures and to improve patient outcomes. IVIG has been used in SLE patients with recurrent spontaneous abortions, and it is usually considered safe and effective. However, it is put in under category C. So use is not recommended unless clearly needed. Similarly, in lactation, the safety has not been established. However, immunoglobulins excreted in milk may help protect neonates from pathogens with a mucosal portal of entry. The medical order while prescribing IVIG should be very clear, and as it is not a generic product, the type of product and the percentage concentration has to be clearly mentioned. The total dose in grams has to be clearly mentioned. The rate of infusion, including the target rate along with any rate changes, has to be clearly mentioned, and any pre-medication or requirement of IV fluids has to be clearly mentioned in the medical order.
Upside.
This is the summary slide. So neurological indications would be CIDP, GBS, MMNCV, myasthenic crisis, autoimmune epilepsies, and encephalitis. ADEM. There are no absolute contraindications for IVIG products. However, noteworthy caveats. Some of them, like this one, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine should not be administered in children who are receiving IVIG therapy, as the immunoglobulin could counter the attenuated virus in the vaccine preparation and render them inactive. This vaccine should be delayed for at least 9 months after the IVIG therapy, or vice versa. I think everybody can go through the summary slide. Thank you.